Good morning, everybody. It's quite a strange video that I'm making today for you guys. I feel I need to say just a couple of words before we start. Obviously, yeah, my thoughts are very much with you, and in this time of great uncertainty, and I think I think that the important thing is I- I'm 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 preparing this lesson for you, and I'm putting it on. I'm going to carry on preparing lessons for you exactly as planned. Um, and I think it's important to understand the various reasons for that. I suppose, first of all, the practical reason. We're still awaiting information from the examination board, from the Ofqual, which is the government office that oversees examinations, about how they're going to manage the situation this summer. But obviously, one of the possibilities is that you could actually be sitting this examination in September, say, at a later date than planned. We don't quite have the information about that yet, but Mrs. Broadhurst will be issuing that. That's one reason. I think another reason is just simply for the intrinsic value of learning. We have been pursuing this course for nearly 2 years, and we need to see it through. And hopefully, you are curious and want to continue to learn about German history up to 1990. So I think it is important, just purely in terms of, as I say, the intrinsic value of learning. And I think another reason to push on is just simply, I think we're all, while we're self-isolated, etc., are establishing routines. And I think for me, I can't speak for you, but I'm sure it is the case, just sort of like getting back into the groove and sort of like working to the routines that we've been working in for the last couple of years is really important. There was a part of me that I woke up this morning and thought, well, do I really need to do this video? But I thought, no, I want to. It is really important, and it'll make me feel good just sort of sitting down and doing it exactly as planned. So there's a range of things. Okay, so that's that. I hope you're all well, and well, you know the routine with the YouTube videos. All the material I will have emailed you, or I will this morning email you a link, so you can print off the mind map and the notes and so on, and everything that is referenced in this video you can have on the desk in front of you. I think you need to do that, so I would say don't actually continue with this video until you've got the materials that you actually need for the video, and we'll then push on. Okay, so it's the collapse of the German Democratic Republic, 1989 to 1990. Okay, and as I go through, I'll obviously say at intervals, now's a good time to pause the video. The great thing about a video as opposed to a lesson is you can shut me up and take a moment to read what's on the screen at your own leisure. Okay, so I'll indicate when those are the best times to do that. Okay, so the opening slide there shows the day. It's actually the summer of 1990, the 1st of July, when the currency exchange happened. We'll come on to that. But first, and this was part of the plan, so you may want to move through the next part fairly quickly. Entirely up to you. So the original plan was, in today's lesson, you'd begin the lesson with a mind map. I asked you to look at Depth Study 3, which is the New Reich, 1933 to 35. And I said to you that you would have one of the mind maps, and then you would have 5 minutes to map everything on as quickly as you could to try to remember. So there it is. Obviously, if you go to the Padlet page, you can print off this particular page, which is on the PowerPoint. Remember, select the page before you click print. Don't print all, otherwise you'll get 42 pages churning out. And just have a quick sort of like go see how much of it you can remember. Okay, so it is the issue of state versus party, the institutional chaos that existed inside Nazi Germany. And those are the four strands: the Weimar era, the state independence from the NSDAP, NSDAP control over the state, plenipotentiaries, and the reasons why there was this institutional chaos, this confusion. Okay, so mapping out 23 different strands there to try to write something down on. So pause the video, print it off, have a go. And the next few slides in the video will take you through the content, which again you can pause and check off what you got right. Okay, so I'll move on. Party and state in the Weimar era. If you wish to pause, do so. Moving on. The independence of the state from Nazi party control. Moving on. The gradual assertion of the power of the party over the state. Moving on. The creation of new party agencies and organisations. Different examples. And finally, the reasons for the confusion, with examples drawn from Nazi economy, economic policy and foreign policy. And another example from the armed forces. Okay, so again, your next lesson, and again I'll do an online video for you, will be on Monday, I think. And so again, the intention was, and it still continues to be, so yeah, you work on it. We'll begin that lesson and I'll give you one of the 6 mind maps from Depth Study 4, establishing a ruling the new Federal Republic. That's obviously a bit closer to us because obviously we did that at the beginning of year 13. And again, I'll give you 5 minutes to add 1 point to each strand. So there are the mind maps for Depth Study 4. So you'll get one of those at the start of the lesson on Monday. Okay, let's get into then today's lesson about the collapse of East Germany in 1990. And I'll just begin with the final slides from last lesson. I'm not going to read them to you, but just pause the video and read through just to get the information back into your head. Okay, so in a nutshell, we reached that sort of point where the Berlin Wall had been pulled down, and Chancellor Kohl suddenly announced his 10-point plan, a complete new direction in policy, but in which he now started to focus on reunification as a viable thing to do, okay, which had never really been considered before, certainly in the previous 20, 30 years. With Ostpolitik, remember, the acceptance was that 2 separate Germanys was necessary in the Cold War context and too dangerous to even think about having a reunification. But suddenly Kohl announced it, but it was very much of a long-term plan. That's the sort of point at the bottom there. Deliberately vague because it was a long-term plan aiming for possibly 10 years. But there was mention within it, within the 10-point plan, about within this 10-point plan about us taking a staged approach. So full unification eventually, say in 10 years, would be political reunification, where the 2 countries would merge their political structures. But as a staging post, he mentioned a economic, bringing the two economies together, keeping two separate countries but merging the economies and creating some sort of confederate structure. The aim of creating a federation linking the two Germanys was mooted. So that was all part of the 10-point plan. Next slide. Okay, now the point here, remember, and this is from last lesson, is that Cole's 10-point plan was greeted very, very enthusiastically by the people. Okay, so I'd sort of use that phrase again, at the grassroots level. I think that's an important phrase to use. Popular, okay, popular approval. In other words, from below. Think of our social pyramid. Okay, the enthusiasm was at the bottom there. Okay, with the masses, the ordinary people in both East and West Germany. And we talked about how when in December 1989 Cole visited East Germany, he was taken aback by the huge welcome that he was given by the East German people, treated like a hero. So on that level, the 10-point plan was very, very popular, and it took Cole aback. Next slide. Okay. Why then was it significant? We now know, of course, as historians, that the full political reintegration, reunification of the two Germanys actually happened not 10 years later, but it happened 10 months later in October 1990. So with that keyword hindsight, we can see how important the 10-point plan was. It was much more important. It turned out to be much more important than it was thought to be at the time. The Allies, for example, didn't really take it very seriously, weren't that particularly interested in it. But what we're saying here is it was taken seriously by the ordinary people, and that pressure from below, okay, the grassroots level, on the key leaders, in particular the four powers, forced the four powers to take it seriously. So because the four powers did not greet Cole's 10-point plan with the same enthusiasm that the German people had greeted it. So you've got that sort of tension there. You've got disinterest from above at the top of the pyramid, the people in power, but you've got real popular enthusiasm from below. And what really played out over the next 10 months is that the popular enthusiasm was the main force that drove the reunification, because it changed the awareness of the four allies in particular, who at this stage would be the main obstacle. Now that's the theme that we'll pick up in the next lesson and the final lesson for this depth study, which brings the story to a close. Okay, so as you can see, we're there, and we've got one more lesson which I'll do on Monday, which is reunification and reasons for acceptance by the four powers. Okay, so again, I don't need to talk you through the books there, but you've got the page numbers, and all of those books are on the Padlet page. So make sure you pick up the additional reading, and I say in particular the Turner is very, very good because it's very clear, but Carr is good as well, as a good sort of synopsis. So let's move on. Okay, so usual routine. Hopefully you got the mind map printed off and it's in front of you. As I said, to make sure you've got space around the mind map to map your points, I would suggest you stick 2 sheets of A4 together to make an A3 size sheet, and then stick the mind map into the middle of it, something like that. Okay, but that's for you to do. You can pause this video while you do that if you wish, but we will now move on. So 4 strands to cover. Okay, so mounting economic problems. To be completely honest, much of this lesson is covering material, is just a recap of material that you already know. So the way I'll do it is I'll read through the in a nutshell with you. Okay, you can pause, and then the next, exactly as in the lesson, the next couple of slides give the detail that sits beneath the summary, and that detail you need to map onto your mind map. Okay, so use the pause facility on YouTube to help you do this. Okay, so in a nutshell, mounting economic problems. I'll just read it to you. The East German economy had, as we've already seen from previous lessons, considerable long-term weaknesses. Okay, so just sort of highlighting that sort of notion of long-term, okay, which had existed for decades. Now, last lesson we looked at the short-term issues, the immediate issues, 1918-1990, which resulted, as we saw, in the opening of the frontiers between East and West Germany, the falling of the Berlin Wall and the opening of the frontiers. And those events further damaged confidence in the East German economy. And so the East German economy was already in serious decline because of the migration issue, etc., which we've already studied. But the sudden opening of the frontiers and the mass enthusiasm to escape to the West accelerated, and that's obviously a key word, okay, because you're talking about change. You need to use that word when you write about this, the economic decline of East Germany. So you've got Chancellor Kohl, who, as we said, had drawn up a 10-point plan immediately following the fall of the Berlin Wall. And what we're saying, the events that followed over the next few months, this sort of like accelerated East German decline, actually played to the hands of Chancellor Kohl. Because, as we said, the obstacle that Kohl faced was convincing the four wartime allies, USA, USSR, Britain and France, that to take his plan seriously. And that was a major obstacle. And we'll look at that next lesson. Okay. But what the events that we're looking at this lesson, the accelerated economic decline, gave Chancellor Kohl an opportunity. We've used that word opportunism before, and he was a great opportunist, Kohl, to apply leverage, okay, to get the allies, to get the leaders of America, the Soviet Union, Britain and France to take his plan to reunify Germany seriously. And that's really what this is about, okay, this particular first strand is about. To consider that the option of reunification could actually happen much earlier than he had stated in his original plan, which was very much of a long term, possibly as long as 10 years for this to happen. Okay, so that's that. So we'll now move on to the detail. So again, use the pause facility so you can map information onto the mind map. And I'll add a bit of comment as I go through, but not much. So the first slide, that looks at the significance of East Germany's economic decline. Nearing collapse. Increasingly clear that East Germany couldn't really survive much longer as a viable state. So those points gave Kohl's 10-point plan credibility in his negotiations. That's a bit about leverage. There's that word, leverage. And we'll look at that next lesson about how he was able to apply leverage in 1990 on the four allies. Moving on to the next slide. So pretty much of a recap, but just sort of like saying instability, East German economic instability had been a long-term issue, okay? And I think, yeah, that thing about confidence, the success of an economy is underpinned by the confidence that people have in the economy, okay? So the Great Depression of 1929 was triggered by a lack of confidence of people in the American economy. That's what caused the Wall Street crash. People, they got frightened, they pulled their savings out, okay? Well, it's a similar sort of issue here. The confidence of not just the East Germans, but people around the world, investors in the East German economy, has been on the wane for some time now, largely because of the visible sign of East Germans moving west, which shows that they don't really want to stay in their country. So there was an increased awareness around the world of the massive difference between East and West Germany. Okay, and there's a useful map there that shows the migration issues between 1989 and 1991. So the key thing is East Germany was facing a considerable loss of her greatest economic resource, which was skilled workers, manpower, but particularly the fact they were skilled. And it had been ongoing, but it accelerated now, 1989 to 1990. So there's an interesting fact there about the SED, which was the ruling party of East Germany in October 1989. Remember, it changed its name to the PDS, commissioned a report, and there's some useful statistics there about the desperate economic plight. Okay, so I'm moving on to the next slide now. You may want to pause if you still want to make notes from that. And here we have the new problems in 1990 that are now triggered by this mass exodus that is with basically open frontiers now. Previously it was restricted by travel restrictions, but now it is completely open. So East Germany fully open now to competition with West Germany, and it simply could not compete. Previously East Germany was able to had markets with Eastern European countries. East Germany was the leading microelectronics producer. Okay, but in the context of when there was a strong iron curtain between East and West, at least the GDR could sell its products to the East. But now that there are open frontiers, West Germany has got full competition. And the whole of Europe became aware that East Germany's greatest commodity, microelectronics, were shoddy in comparison to what the West was producing. So by the start of 1890, East German factories were in serious decline, losing business because of West German business being able to compete with them. Okay, I'm moving on to the next slide now. You may want to pause. Okay, so I'll build the picture up the way we usually do in lessons. So that goes back to our big picture, and what we've just looked at is the mounting economic problem. So we're now going to move in onto the migration problem. And let's just take you through in a nutshell. Okay, the key points. And again, this is largely everything you already know, so we don't need to spend very long on this one. The migration problem had been a long-term problem. Okay, there's that phrase long-term which you need to be using for East Germany since the early 1950s. Remember, East Germany came into existence in 1949, and it was there from the beginning, this problem. East Germans wanting to go and live in the more prosperous West. And obviously in the 1950s, movement was relatively easy because the frontiers were still open at that time. And that's why in the late 1950s, East Germany began to close her frontiers, and then it was fully closed in 1961 with the building of the Berlin Wall. So in the 1960s onwards, the ability of East Germans to escape was severely restricted by the closing of her frontiers with the West. The Berlin Wall finally closed that gap. And also, during the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet Union backed East Germany militarily and economically. Okay, presence of Warsaw Pact troops, etc., etc. So at least East Germany was being propped up by the Soviet Union. But it all changed, remember, with Gorbachev taking power in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. And that meant that the Soviet Union's economic support for East Germany and her military support for East Germany was withdrawn. We've done that already. And in the second half of the 1980s, there was then this issue of East Germans escaping to the West, and the whole travel ban situation, and gradually Honecker coming around to the fact that he needed to issue temporary permits. We've covered all of that. Okay, I don't need to go back through that. And as we've seen, the migration from East Germany to West Germany in the course of the late 80s turned from a trickle to an increasing flood, in particular in 1989, once routes to the west via Hungary, etc., began to open. And then the collapse of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 meant that the frontiers were fully open. And we look at the statistics of what was then happening is, on average, 2,000 East Germans were leaving for the West each day, which is an astonishing figure. And it's not just the numbers, it's the fact that they were mainly East Germany's youngest, most skilled workers. Okay, so we use the phrase often, the brain drain. In other words, the people who were leaving East Germany were the people who had the skills and the abilities to rebuild East Germany's economy. But with losing them, the possibility of East Germany recovering is virtually nil. So it had an amazing impact, devastating impact on the East German economy as we move into 1990. Okay, so those are the key points. We'll move on to the detail. So, that's a long-term problem since East Germany had been created in 1949. And of course the decision eventually to construct a Berlin Wall was largely made in order to retain East Germany's depleting workforce. And of course that was 1961, August 12th to 13th, 1961. So Honecker's policy in the 1980s, we've already done that, so I won't talk you through that. You can pause the video if you want to pick out some points there. Moving on. And again, we've already done that. In fact, it didn't work. And then the explosion on the 2nd of May 1989 when Hungary relaxed its borders with Austria. And there's a photograph there of the Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock and his Hungarian colleague Gyula Horn cutting the Iron Curtain in June 1989. Again, we've covered that in previous lessons, so moving on. And again, we covered this in the last lesson. Fall of the Berlin Wall, there's that figure of 2,000 East Germans, mainly young, well-educated East Germans. And again, there's that sort of map, which is useful. And again, I'll zoom in for you so you can sort of like look at the colour coding. And that is available on the Padlet page, which sort of shows the devastating impact in terms of loss of key skilled workers at that time, okay, and which areas were being particularly impacted. Moving on. Okay, so we've covered 2 of the 4 strands. We're halfway through the lesson now. So we're now going to move on to relatively new material as we move into the events of 1990 inside East Germany. Let's just drill into this in a bit more detail. So we'll start off with Modrov's failure. Modrov was the East German leader. Okay. Remember, it went through a series of leaders change after the fall of Honecker. And at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the East German leader, and remember the ruling party was the SED, okay? But the SED, remember, changed its name to the PDS at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I've captured that here in a nutshell details. So let's just have a quick look at the points here. Okay, so as we have seen, in late 1989, the ruling political party in East Germany, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, okay, so that, remember, goes way back to the 1940s. After World War II, Stalin forcibly merged the SPD and the Communist Party into a united socialist party called the Socialist Unity Party, okay. And that was the lesson drawn from the 1930s. The argument was, of course, that if the SPD and the communists had been a united front, then Hitler would never have taken power. But So it was in part a response to that. So the SED had been the ruling party for 40 years. Okay. Now, as we've seen, in late 1989, the SED announced an intention to reform their country. Okay, and that was symbolised by the fact they changed their party's name. We did that last lesson, to the Party of Democratic Socialism. Now, I think I used this phrase last lesson. It was, again, a classic case, a bit like Max von Baden years before, of too little too late. Okay, the new East German leader, Modrov, the leader of the SED, or now renamed the PDS, followed through in early 1990 by announcing further reforms. So, for example, he abolished the dreaded secret police in East Germany, the Stasi, thinking that that would boost popularity for the East German government. In fact, it didn't. It just simply made it worse. It meant that people could protest more freely. And of course, the problem is that these last-ditch reforms were political reforms, but what the people wanted were reforms that would address the country's desperate economic situation. And so protests continued. And the other problem is that Modrov and the leaders of East Germany continued to hold on to the delusion that East Germany could continue to exist as a separate country. And yet it was clear, think about what we said, that the East German response to the 10-point plan is that the people at the grassroots, the East Germans on the streets, are now desperately calling out for a reunited Germany, a single German state. That they don't want to have a separate East Germany anymore. Okay, so that popular unhappiness, okay, with the PDS as the ruling party, suddenly exploded on the 18th of March 1990, because one of the reforms that had been announced was that there would now be a free general election. First time ever. The country had never had a free general election. Okay, ever since 1949, when the country came into existence, there had been other political parties, but basically it was fixed so that the SED would always win the elections and would dominate the government. But now, in this new climate of trying to introduce political freedom, there was an open general election, and the PDS, the old SED, stood as just one of several parties in that election. And Modrov was clearly extremely naive in thinking that the people would vote for his party. And it became obvious in the elections of 18th of March 1990, when the PDS was literally voted out of office. So a new political party took power, and the new political party was the East German CDU. Remember the CDU? We've got the West German CDU, Adenauer's party, okay, that we did all about in Depth Study 4. Well, a Christian Democratic Union Party was there in East Germany, and the CDU, led by a politician called de Lausière, won that election. Okay, and the reason they won that election is their ticket, their big election promise, as if they were voted into power, was called Alliance for Germany. In other words, they said, if we take power, then our main election promise is that we will work with Chancellor Kohl in the West to try to bring about a reunited Germany as quickly as possible. And they were elected into office. They didn't get an overall majority. They had to form a coalition. Okay, so they became a new coalition party. They had to work with the Social Democrats. Another feature of the election was that because it was now open frontiers, that the equivalents in West Germany, the equivalent parties, were able to give support to the party in East Germany. So therefore, the West German CDU campaigned and provided campaign funds and materials to the East German CDU, which helped them achieve the votes that they were looking for. And that happened at every level. So the West German SPD, Social Democratic Party, helped the East German SPD in those elections. Okay, and I suppose that's probably another reason why the PDS didn't do very well, because there was no equivalent party in the West to help them. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. We'll move on, and you can then map the details onto your mind map and pick up the details. So again, you can pause if you wish. I'll just pick out one or two things there. So there's a picture of Hans Modroff. There's the point. Lots of promises, but really not really following through. Okay, and there was the key thing. He continued to believe that East Germany needed to exist as a separate country. Okay, he did get rid of the East German police, the Stasi, replaced it with a watered-down security force, but these were not the reforms that people wanted. Moving on. So, little impact. You can see the pictures there. That was a very famous event, worth remembering that, the 15th of January 1990. The Stasi headquarters were stormed and smashed. I mean, unheard of. I mean, the Stasi, the dreaded East German secret police, people had lived in terror of these people. Now the mob basically stormed the headquarters because they've been abolished. And there's the point about the reforms didn't really go anywhere near far enough. Okay. And the desperate economic situation. By this point, West German goods and currency were flooding into East Germany, and there was considerable economic chaos. Moving on. So, elections were set for the 18th of March 1990. And as I said, in the final point in a nutshell was that West German politicians played a critical role because they were able to provide support to their equivalent parties in East Germany. Okay, so for example, the new East German SPD received support from the West German SPD leader Oskar Fontaine. Okay, now Oskar Fontaine supported reunification, but he wanted a more orderly transition, a slower process towards reunification. But the West German CDU, led by Chancellor Kohl, gave big backing to the Eastern CDU, and the Eastern CDU very much latched on to Chancellor Kohl's 10-point plan, and their ticket was an alliance for Germany. And they campaigned on the promise that if they took office, that they would pursue a rapid move towards full reunification with West Germany. And that was a very, very popular message in the East German elections of 18th of March 1990. So Lothar de Maizière was the leader of the Eastern CDU, and there's a photograph from that election campaign, very interestingly, in the background. A lesser official, but still quite important in the East German CDU at that time, a very young Angela Merkel, who, of course, is the Chancellor of Germany at the moment. Okay, she was originally in her early days an East German politician and a member of the East German CDU. And there are the outcomes of the elections. Okay, so the old Socialist Unity Party, which was renamed the PDS, unsurprisingly didn't do very well. Okay, the East German people clearly were not interested in a party that wanted to keep a separate East Germany, so they won only 66 seats. The SPD, who did want reunification, but they wanted slow reunification, did okay. They won 88 seats, but the East German CDU, which had campaigned on a ticket for rapid reunification, stormed the election. They won 192, not quite the majority. They needed 200 to get a majority. So de Maizière, his party, became the new East German government, but they had to basically form a coalition, admit a few members of the SPD and the League of Free Democrats into the cabinet. Okay, so again, you may want to pause and just take a bit of time mapping that information across, but if you're ready, we can now move on. So there's the picture. We've covered 3 of the 4 strands. We now just get on to that final one, the economic integration. Let's have a look at that. So, in a nutshell, what then happened? Now that a pro-unification party has taken office, in other words, the East German CDU, okay, now that that has happened, the way was clearly open for Chancellor Kohl to move quickly on the first stage of his 10-point plan. So suddenly Kohl and the 10-point plan become important again. And remember, the Kohl's 10-point plan, as written down, was a long-term plan to move in stages towards full German reunification. But the early stage was to integrate the 2 economies in some way. So Kohl now, suddenly he sees the outcome of the East German election, exactly what he wants. His counterpart, de Maizière, in the East, has taken control over the East German government. De Maizière also wants rapid reunification. So they literally wasted no time. Early in 1990, they met in Strasbourg, and they set a date to reintegrate, to combine their 2 economies on the 1st of July 1990, that quickly. Okay, so they literally wasted no time. So they said, we'll still have 2 separate Germanys, there'll still be 2 separate political entities, but they'll have a integrated single economy. So plans were worked out. Okay, so on that particular date, the East German mark was effectively abolished. That was the currency in East Germany was effectively abolished, and arrangements were put into place for East Germans to convert their money into the West German currency called the Deutschmark. Okay. Now, fundamentally though, it was a big event. It was greeted very, very enthusiastically by East Germans in particular. Very exciting, this reintegration of the 2 economies. But we can now see that it was the process was fundamentally flawed, and that it had ultimately a very negative impact, and it's still there today. Okay, we now have a reunified Germany, but even today there is a huge division of wealth between the East and the West, and in the united Germany, and economic analysts have looked at this and say, yeah, part of the reason for that was an opportunity missed, that the plan of the 1st of July 1990 was too hastily rushed through and not thought through properly. Okay, it was basically fundamentally flawed. Okay, so for example, there was an unexpected rush of East Germans to purchase higher quality West German goods, because suddenly they could convert much of their own money that they had, their savings, into West German marks, which they can now use to buy West German goods, and they weren't interested in buying East German goods with these with the money they had. They wanted to buy West German. So, in terms of supply and demand economics, it had a devastating impact on East German businesses. Nobody was interested in buying their goods. So many East German businesses simply went under in the second half of 1990, and there was no bailout facility. And it's still an issue today. Okay, that's really important to understand. 30 years later, we can still see the evidence of that. Yes, full political reunification did happen at the end of 1990, and we'll look at that next lesson. But the future reunified Germany was a very socially divided Germany, and it still is today, largely because of this economic integration of July 1990, which was fundamentally flawed. Okay, so that's in a nutshell. So again, we'll move on to the detail. So there's a picture of Kohl and de Maizière in Strasbourg. Okay, so the declaration of 1st of July is the date. for monetary, economic and social union. East German mark would replace the West German mark. And the details are there, is that East Germans are offered a one-to-one currency exchange for up to 4,000 marks each, which has basically meant that their wages and basic savings could be immediately converted over at a very good exchange rate, one-to-one. So if you've got, say, 2,000 marks in your bank account, East German marks, you suddenly convert it to 2,000 West German Deutschmarks. Okay, larger amounts though, beyond 4,000 mark cap, you got less favourable exchange rates. So you'd need to have 2 East German marks to buy 1 Deutschmark. For example, property and things like that. And so in reality, if you actually look at the total wealth of the East German economy, it was actually 4 East German marks for 1 Deutschmark. Eventually, the East German coins were all melted down and the paper money was burned. It all went out of existence eventually in 2002. Pause if you want to there. I'm going to move on to the next page. So the impact. Okay, so there's the point about it being fundamentally flawed. You can see a picture there of the excitement on that day. Wow, it's like great, I can convert my wages over on a one-to-one basis, get Deutschmarks and head off into the West and spend my money on high quality West German goods. And that basically was what was happening. People were just spending their wages and basic savings. And there's the detail to sort of pick up. Okay, so there's the point we made earlier about it did cause a considerable rush to purchase West German goods, so the market for East German goods completely evaporated. So what we can now see is actually it caused a meltdown of the East German economy, led to massive unemployment, bankruptcy of East German businesses because nobody wanted to buy their goods. It also provided no incentive for West German businesses to relocate to the East. That hadn't really been thought through. There needed to be incentives, but what was the point? There was no market. People in the East didn't have the money, so there was very little interest in West German businesses in relocating. Eastern goods, even though they were lesser quality, were still as expensive as the goods in the West. So bottom line is, East German businesses, those who were able to stay alive, simply could not compete. So in the long term, businesses continued to close down. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide now, but you might want to pause. And there's our summary. Okay, so we've finished this lesson. Okay, so summary is there for you. Okay, so which will be Monday, is the final lesson in the step study, and as we said, that'll be about the actual reunification itself. This is where we'll look at the 4 occupying powers. We will look at the USA, the Soviet Union, Britain and France. They were an obstacle. They were not in favour of reunification because of the Cold War situation. But with this pressure from below, these events that are happening, and how do they respond to it? And of course, Cole using it as leverage. So to prepare, read pages 168 to 73 of the textbook. Okay, I'll also put onto a Padlet page my notes, so you can download those and print them off before Monday and read through my notes as well. And those are the sorts of areas that we will be covering. That's it. Take care, be safe. I know you're all out there. You can hear me. I'm here. We're all doing well. I'm just thinking that this video will continue to stay in YouTube, and probably I'll be using it and automatically for future groups in subsequent years, and they'll be thinking, what on earth is he talking about? So probably just need to sort of like highlight for them that this video was recorded in March 2020 during the coronavirus crisis, which will one day become a significant episode in the history books. Okay, as significant, if not more significant, than the events that I'm teaching you about here. We are living through history at the moment. Okay, so anyway, all the best, and I'll be back online with another YouTube video on Monday with more materials for you. Thank you. Goodbye.